Alrighty, hello and welcome. I don't know who's watching this, and I frankly don't care. This is a short guide to war and the few things that matter to it. Step 1 that we'll begin with is what do you plan to do? Now, this is far more important than any battlefield formation or any objective on the battlefield you attempt to capture. Because no matter what you do on the battlefield, it matters little if you don't have a goal. So, I'm going to introduce three images, which if you're watching, will be on the screen. The first one I have on the screen is called Raid. The purpose of this is to harass your enemy's territory. It's not to fight them, it's to destroy their property. This image is taken from a game that I have currently been playing for a little while, and it shows three distinct characteristics needed in order to perform this operation. First of all, an understanding of where my troops are coming from, where they'll be passing through, and then the target area. Now, the big thing here is to understand the areas of your controlling lands that your troops need to come from before they can even get anywhere near the front lines. Because if it takes 48 hours for your armies to get from your reserve positions to your front lines, that's 2 days you have armies not fighting. Right? So you need to plan that ahead of time. If your army takes 8 weeks to get from their barracks to organize, to get to the front line, and then be ready for a pitched battle, that's 8 weeks that you're vulnerable to attack. So the biggest thing ahead of time is to have a forward post. Acts as basically a forward observation post. It'll allow you to see the enemy army before it comes, and it will also act as a forward supply base, which means that if there's supplies there waiting, your reinforcements don't have to move at the speed of their supply wagons, which is typically slower than the average marching soldier. Or if you have an old cavalry unit, the entire cavalry army could move faster than any wagon unless they hitched all their horses to wagons, but at that point you're just wasting the horses. Um, the game, the map on for the map for the game on the screen is an airship game. Basically, you control airships, which have fighters and guns on all of them. So terrain really doesn't matter for this, and that's what I thought would be a good starting point, because here you don't have to worry about terrain, you just need to think about distance and a little bit of logistics. So Stronwald is the closest allied capital, with there being several friendly cities along this area. Now, the reason why the raid target zone has been placed here is because this is where a prime amount of resources are, but without this other empires actually having forces in, which means that all the player-owned sites here have to be defended by the players, which means they can run out of ammo, any planes that are shot down are permanently shot down, whereas if you're fighting in here, it doesn't really run out. Because, otherwise players would just own the entire map and have everything destroyed. You can't have a game that does that. So that's why this area is particularly chosen. Now, you'll notice that the supply line basically starts at Stronwald. For the purpose of this, I'm not including all the others, because Stronwald is basically the trade hub of the Empire. Any point south of Stronwald, and it's not really worth bringing forces from. At this point, you're really just not bringing anything. The cost of what it would take to bring those forces or supplies from even just Trier to Foreign Guard, or I believe it's Foreign Guard, I can't tell, to the forward post would simply just not be worth it, both in time and in resources. And so Stronwald, since it's the closest trade hub that's friendly, is our maximum south point. Now, we would be recruiting forces from Vergen, I'm going to call it Torngard for now, Alphonsus Varenium, Almen, and Stronwald itself. Now, what this basically has said is that I'm consuming all of the forces in the northeastern part of this Empire. That basically means that if something were to come in, say, this way, the northeastern section of the Empire would be vulnerable. But that's... For raiding, your goal is more just to annoy and steal some loot. So, always keep things like, what can my enemy do to me while I'm doing this? Always keep things like that in mind. Now, the forward post itself is in a more or less neutral territory. They're the unclaimed islands in between the nations. They effectively act as a border, neutral zone. Now, that's very important because that means that there's no official claim here, which means that there's no AI or official armies getting in the way. So, once we've had that secured, we have resources going to bases that we have fortified, we have stationary guns, we have fighters patrolling the airs. It becomes a supply depot, which means that for our active duty ships, all they have to do is come back here, halfway to the Empire, to fully resupply. You're literally reducing the amount of time they have to wait to go back into the battlefield in half. That can save you in terms of traditional warfare, that could save you thousands of lives. That could also win you a good couple victories, because that means that instead of waiting 30 days for your archers to have arrows again, you're only waiting 15. Or if you find that a sudden spear block suddenly doesn't have functional spears anymore, that's they're waiting half the amount of time now to get their spears back, or in this case, ammunition and fuel. Now the big thing that happens here is when you start the raiding process. Now, I have it, for simplicity's sake, that you split your forces in half. One goes in a southeasterly direction, and one pretty much goes in a pure eastern one with a slight northeast heading. As they venture forth, they try to meet together. Typically, basically, 1/3 of the original amount goes north from the southeastern force, and from the eastern force, 1/3 of it goes south, and it continues on until they meet in this general area. Once that is done, they would then return to the supply depot. The supply depot would be continually fortified and resupplied. At this point, the raiding has been done. If an enemy force should arrive from the south, or enough resistance has been put up in this area, the raid either becomes cancelled or completed, depending on the opinion of the leader and the men. Once this has been completed, the ships simply return with all their new goodies back to the Empire. That's raiding. The objective of raiding, I'd like to remind you, is not to destroy your enemy or to conquer them. It's to take their stuff. Basically, it's saying, you've got some shinies I wanted for me, and I'm willing to kill you and risk my life in the process. Now, the next thing, if I can get it to work... now, this looks like a confusing mess, I know. This is what's classified, I've classified as the indirect hit to the enemy. I'll make this relatively simple. The blue circle represents the recruiting area, the general area where we'll be recruiting soldiers from. For all intents and purposes, this is the entirety of the Empire. Now, the primary areas are from the north, and the southernmost port is roughly Horg. The reason why is Crystalmire, Wellyre, and Trier act as a trading triumvirate. Crystalmire gives plenty of raw resources, Wellyre gives plenty of oil for fuel, and Trier acts as a general trading and manufacturing hub. Horg is something of a little bit in between Trier and Schronwald, acting as a general trade zone and supply depot for those who want to make the long haul to Crystalmire. Now, all that confusing verbiage out of the way, the green lines represent the direction of our forces, the general area where they're supposed to head. As this will see, it hits us to this larger neutral island, where it then splits into two forces. It heads here, and then hits from the north, and then the second one goes directly southeast towards the enemy heartland. Now, for your knowledge, in this game, if enough players are able to actually do it, they can conquer a city. They haven't implemented it yet, the last time I had played, but that is eventually the goal. The yellow circles are representative of bases that we need to find, not find, create. The yellow ones specifically are supply bases. This means that we'll have one here in the middle. This is the primary supply base, as it will be supplying two different fleets. Now, from here, the southeast fleet will then move southeast, and once arriving on the enemy mainland, will secure a zone where it can create the local supply base, effectively reducing the resupply time to basically within an hour. Also, the northeast assault will then create a supply base where they can harass the northern border. The northern border is designed as a distraction and is intended to hit first. The black circles are enemy fortified bases, very likely locations of where they would be. The purple lines are designed to, I guess dark pink, whatever, are designed to represent enemy attacks. As seen, the enemy would most likely gather in their northwestern positions, then move forward from their fort on the mainland to the neutral island, where they most likely already have one, and attempt to destroy our supply base. A logical move. Doesn't matter if you have 1,000 men. If you have 1,000 men and one bullet, those men are only going to fire one bullet. Even if you only have enough mouths to feed and none of those men, none of them are going to be firing that one bullet for long. Alright. The pink line here is the general border line. This is what's classified as Step 1 planning. Step 1 planning is the initial incursion into an enemy region, such as the Normandy situation during the events of World War II on D-Day. The initial goal was to breach Normandy. Normandy is the general name for northern France. This is roughly equivalent to that. Unfortunately, landmass equivalents aren't something I can do on the fly with this, since there's not a geographic measuring tool at all, which doesn't help. But suffice it to say, this would be the first step, the second step being going south and all that good stuff. Let's see, the next picture. The next picture is what I've classified as direct assault. The blue circle has remained the same, so has the green. Although you might notice something. I've now increased Ulm, one of our rear positions, while abandoning Verg. The reason is this strategy has a focus on strongly hitting the enemy in the center and in the south. The enemy has a very strong center, or most likely will, as the center is the closest and shortest distance between the two empires, thus the most heavily fortified. In this situation, the red circles represent, the dark red circles anyways, represent friendly bases that have been in place. These represent a combination of supply and fortresses. The circles themselves are designed to represent the general region where it's designed to be. The line and then bright red circle is the target area, the area in which we would attempt to fight. This line here represents the extreme borderline zone. The borderline zone is the most likely area of guaranteed enemy resistance. Past this point, enemy resistance is guaranteed. Thus, it becomes important for us to establish beachheads in several positions before advancing to the enemy's guaranteed defense line. By doing this, we secure our front line as well as forward supply and fortress bases, before the fight has even truly begun. Now, I know if you're Michael, you're primarily listening to this because I said I'd mention Game of Thrones. So we're going straight into that. Now tell me, which of these two pictures look more scary to attack? This picture of Winterfell, or this picture of King's Landing? I'll be switching between these two pictures, so try not to be confused too much. Winterfell is a relatively small city. Actually, it's not even a city, it's more of a fort than anything else. One of its primary advantages is it is a multi-layered defense. What this means is it has two sets of walls. Its outer wall and then an inner wall, which most likely protects the keep. The reason why this is important is when compared to King's Landing, the King's Landing only has a very large outer wall followed by a very small secondary wall followed by the keep itself. Now the keep is nothing to laugh at either. But the difference between these is that it is very hard to breach the walls of Winterfell, while it is relatively easy to breach the walls of King's Landing. And I'll point this out. The reason why it's actually harder to breach Winterfell is because the overlapping fields of fire. Now, depending on what's on actually top of these, some of these are hollow tops, which means that they actually could have ballistae, which are basically giant crossbows mounted on them. Now, given the way we've seen Winterfell, it's actually highly unlikely. So the top parts actually probably act as observation slots, or are filled with observation slots, but also have some ammunition stored in them. Now, you'll notice that there's circular designs in the towers. The advantage of circular towers compared to square ones is circular towers, when an archer is aiming down, basically doesn't have a blind spot except right next to the tower itself. With a square tower, you can hide in the corners. Now, let's take a look at King's Landing. King's Landing is nothing but square. In fact, in several of its positions, one of which is off the screen because, well, it's simply not available in the picture, it's a square it's a perfect 90-degree corner. The enemy has basically 3 points to abuse because you can't see in those 3 points. And you'll notice that this is something that's, without the entirety of King's Landing, relatively square walls, as well as square towers. Now the reason behind this is square towers are a lot easier to build, and are a lot more resistant to actual damage. Now continuing on this theme, once you breach the walls of Winterfell, it's actually relatively quick as long as you have the proper siege equipment and your soldiers aren't too worn down. As the walls are pretty close to each other, and breaching them typically is breaching the outer wall is a lot harder than actually breaching the interior walls, as the interior walls are secured, as seen here, by simple doors, which can be broken down with hatchets. And at that point, your men will have secured the outer walls and can now rain fire from a more or less protected position, depending on whether or not the wall is what's called double walled, which basically says that these dips, which are where archers shoot from, are on both sides. This is typically not the case, but some, in fact, did have it, as can be seen here in King's Landing. Now what that means is once you're on top of the wall, no matter which side you're being fired from, you have equal amounts of protection, which is very good if your enemy breaches the gates, but does not breach the walls. Now, there's a difference in the fighting once you get inside. Winterfell, if you breach its walls, becomes very desperate fighting. It's more one-on-one or 5-on-5. The simple hallways and courtyards typically just don't allow for more men, which means it turns into a grind fest. And by grind fest, I mean you're simply throwing your men at the enemy soldiers using your numbers. as typically a fortified position like this has many different levels of fortification and defenses designed to disrupt the attacker in various ways. Now, you have to remember, Winterfell was designed as a fort. It was designed as the central authority and military might of the North. King's Landing is designed as a city. Its walls extend around its perimeter, but once you breach it, the city is yours to play with. Now, there are various ways to get into the city. You can attempt, of course, by land, or you can attempt by water. Both of these are highly dangerous. Attempting by water means that the entire time that your boats are attempting to come in, you can be attacked by any siege weaponry on the wall, which is something I'd like to quickly remind people. Siege weapons were not only used by attackers, it was also used by defenders. The most common defensive siege weapon were small catapults as well as ballistae. Once again, a ballistae is basically nothing more than a giant crossbow, which makes excellent for punching through ships. Because if you're able to get a shot underneath the enemy's waterline, the point of the ship that is at water level, the ship may begin to sink. Or should you be able to somehow use a flammable tip for your projectile, you could instead ignite the ship. While this would be difficult, as most wooden ships were treated, it is still possible. Even just to hit the sails would be enough to disrupt the crew long enough. Now, once you have your men actually on the docks, you still have to breach the gate. Now, I'd like to remind you, you just had them come off ships. They're being the enemy knows that they're here, and they're being shot at the entire time. Ships cannot properly carry, unless they are specially designed to, siege weaponry, and even if they do, you have to hope that that ship survives the trip into the harbor, gets to the dock, is able to unload its siege weapons, and then hope to whatever god you believe in that you can actually get it to the gate to then use it. Now, briefly describe what happens at a gate, because it ain't pretty, and I didn't pull up any images for this because it ain't pretty. You can get stoned. You can get shot. You can be piked to death, and what I mean is a 15 to 20 foot long spear just suddenly comes out of nowhere and stabs you from the head. If there's a slot low enough, pikemen can actually stab at you. Or even more terrifying is probably boiling water. Now, you've probably seen boiling oil more than enough times. Sorry, folks, but that really didn't happen. The only few recorded cases of it actually being used would be in the Siege of Byzantium, and the reason is because Byzantium, otherwise known as Constantinople or modern-day Turkey, is, well, they had a few natural oil spots that they had easy access to. The rest of Europe didn't know what the hell oil was for, so burning oil just really wasn't that big of a thing. A few places did it, it worked really well, but the problem is it would just weigh so much, and refilling it took forever, and heating it up took forever too. Water, on the other hand, it was relatively light in comparison. So even when they're like, hey, this works really well, but then they're like, hey, this works a lot better. So, yeah, you could literally be trying to smash open a gate, and then there's boiling water on you. Oh, and I'd like to remind you, you're wearing metal. If you're lucky. If you're wearing armor at all. So, assuming that you breach the gates, now you have a very tough decision to make. How do you fight the enemy? And I mean, what's your tactic of fighting them? Because that's very important, and we're going to move it. And I believe that's what I had the picture set up for. Nope. Okay, I'm way ahead of what my schedule was. Alrighty. So, I'm going to talk briefly here, because apparently I was supposed to say in the strategy section a little bit longer. So, we have various different factions within Westeros who have different styles of fighting. Dorne has a focus on light spear infantry. Stormlands have a focus on medium to heavy infantry, and more or less so do the Crownlands. The Vale has a focus on light cavalry as well as spear blocks. The Riverlands focus on light infantry. The North has a focus on light cavalry and moderate infantry. Westerland has a little bit of money to dab into everything, and the Reach is known for its vast quantity of relatively cheap troops. Now, the reason why this is important is because each one of these has a different fighting style. The North, with its light cavalry and moderate infantry, utilizes this as a harassment. This is mainly due both to the conditions of the North as well as its pure size. The Riverlands has a focus on light infantry because, due to the nature of the Riverlands being mostly swampy, and as it might give you the name, filled with rivers, light infantry have a better focus here, as well as if you fall into the water, you better pray that you're not wearing anything too heavy. The Vale is a highly rocky place, and with their focus on medium to light cavalry as well as spear infantry, makes it very easy for them to attack and defend within their territories. The Crownlands have a focus once more on spear blocks, but also medium to heavy cavalry. This means that they're very good at holding the enemy place, while their cavalry smashes them to bits. The Stormland uses a very similar technique. The Reach has a focus on using lots and lots of spearmen, as well as relatively cheaply trained swordsmen. The focus here is to use pure numbers to overwhelm the enemies. Westerland has a focus on pretty much just making sure that whatever they have is well equipped. Basically, what they take is the best thing to counter the enemy, whatever the enemy has. Although from what we've seen in the show, they follow the standard policy of a spear corps, as well as having several mounted and unmounted swordsmen. Dorne, as its symbol suggests, and as we see several characters throughout the show specialize in, the spear is their most popular weapon. While we are not particularly shown or notified of this, they most likely also utilize lance cavalry. Now, the reason why this is all important is by understanding how these people fight, and thus understanding how your own armies fight, you can plan best on who you can fight, how you can fight them, and when, which is another important factor. Now, you might notice that I skipped over the Iron Isles. Now, the reason behind this is more or less because they're nothing but the Vikings, and their primary focus is on the Navy. Now, for the purpose of this, we're going to take a look at this as if you're attempting to invade Westeros. My personal recommendation is you either want, when it comes to the Iron Isles, no matter what it is, either conquer them or ally with them. The first thing you want to do, above all, is make sure that there's no one around to harass your naval supply lines. Now, yes, here we go. I'll swap over here real quick. Now, this is more of a geography map, seeing the different ways we can invade Westeros. There's different places we could do it from, and for all different reasons. To begin with, let's start with the north. The north is mostly hilly, rocky, woody, but also primarily abandoned, which means that there's actually several good areas to invade from, because simply the enemy won't know that you're there for a good while. The first of these, let's make sure I get it right, would actually be over here, the Stony Shore. The reason why this is important is because there's a natural divide between the northern portions of the north, which is where the heavily fortified and strongly reinforced Winterfell is, as well as the greater houses exist in order to fight off the great foe from the north. Additionally, a natural large river separates it also from the southern cities, meaning that should the northerners be able to retaliate relatively quickly, you have the ability to use a natural defensive position and use of the river. Now, another area I would highly recommend would actually be somewhere. Okay, so we're just going to do this real quick. We're going to assume that for one reason or another, the Iron Isles is a safe place. It has either been allied or conquered. Now from here, you can either directly move into the Riverlands. This gives you a nice central position. Now once the central position is fortified, you could from here attack the enemy in every direction, meaning that you're confusing them and striking them from multiple directions. The obvious problem for this is you're going to piss off a lot of houses at the same time, as well as spreading out your forces. I'd also like to remind you that this is the Riverlands we're talking about, the place known for its rivers and its swamps, which act as both a good and a negative, as this means if you know how to properly use it, you can use those to your advantage, but your enemy can in turn use those and force your hand to attack them in a position you deem unviable. Now, if paint will cooperate, another position to do it from would be Dorne. Dorne's a relatively good position to do as well, as if you were to invade in this general... Oh, come on. Now I forget which one brush I'm using. Oh, come on. No, don't do this to me now. I hate you. Oh well. Okay, we'll just do this. There we go. If you were to land forces here, you could easily take out the major city of Sandstone. By doing this almost immediately, you capture yourself a position. Another area that might be recommended is here, as this secures you a port with access to what appears to be a freshwater river, giving you local water source which is easy to maintain. From here, though, you have a very desperate prospect. You have to go through a mountain pass. This is a nightmare unless you secure it, as this means that the enemy can spend the entire time harassing your army as it moves through a narrow corridor. Just something to think about. There's also... I honestly would not recommend the Crown Lands. The reason behind this, to give you an idea, this is basically the general area I would say avoid landing troops in. Any forces deployed here can be easily countered and very quickly countered, meaning that the enemy can deploy against your forces here quickly and with great numbers of troops. My only recommendation for doing this ever in a position like this, which is basically a straight attack against the enemy capital, is if speed and if the initiative is on your side and you can quickly take over territory. Otherwise, I do not recommend going straight for an enemy capital. Past this point, there are a few other areas. Now, if you're willing to take the risk, you can do it in the far north. You could do it here, which is relatively isolated, and then do the Last Hearth. The bad part about this is there's relatively no terrain features, so you're not talking anything fortified. Or you could do the far more dangerous mountainous deployment. Keep in mind, this basically puts you against mountains and the ocean, which means that while you might have two flanks secured, it also means that the enemy has it too. Now, past this, it becomes purely what you want to do. Now, for instance, if your goal is to quickly capture just the region, the capitals of each region, then my personal recommendation would be the following. We're going to do this real quick. You'll notice that there's an interesting trend amongst capitals. And that is that they typically are along rivers. Come on, stop getting in the way. And the reason why this is important is because it makes them very easy to capture. Oh, and where's yours, Dorn? Dorn, I don't remember what yours is. I think, is yours really just Sunspear? Because that's an original. Whatever. I don't remember what the capital of Dorn is. Oops. That probably would have been a good idea to look up. But anyways, you'll notice that most, if not nearly all, are bordered on the ocean, which means that if you have a truly good naval force and a crap ton of men and plenty of ready-to-go siege equipment, you could take the capitals. Now, by taking the capitals, you are able to eliminate the seat of power of most of your enemies. Now, that makes excellent use of your forces, as this means the central power, and typically money, as well as arms and typically military might, are also focused at these. Let me put this simply. If you're able to capture and hold all these sites, you more or less captured Westeros. From here, it's an expansion of power, flooding in supplies and men. Once you have that, well, it's simply making sure that you hold on to these places. Alrighty, so let's go back. Let's not save that. Alrighty. Next step. How your men actually fight. Before you is a picture of a pike formation. Pike formations were originally intended to fight off large cavalry charges. Simply put, the original way of doing this was to have a shit ton of men with very long spears, and the horses would be too scared to actually charge them. As it turns out, if you whip a horse enough, it'll do whatever you tell it to do. So, now the reason why the actual formation fighting of your troops is important is because even though this is a screenshot from the game, and thus makes it hard to actually tell what's happening, you don't for the purposes of the game, to keep fairness, you have the first two rows fighting. But in an actual pike formation, you'd actually probably have the first four. The reason why is a pike is about 10 to 15 feet long. It's a pretty damn long spear, and the space between one man and the next is only about 3 feet. Which means even a fifth row would have 3 extra feet to harass the... No, because that's 3 feet including themselves. So a fourth row has 3 feet to spare. That means that a single guy, a single swordsman, with one shield and a sword, has to get past 4 spears in the same line just to get within range to stab the fucker. I guess pardon my language if you're someone who's a little too, oh my god about language. What this means is you have 4 guys against 1. This is a terrifying prospect if you're a regular soldier. And even a cavalry formation facing this, I mean, you can have guys who are nowhere near the front line just knocking knights off their horses. The knight never gets to fight back. It's a terrifying prospect for a knight. Now, formations are key to victory. To give you an idea, this is what's called a mixed formation. Now, this is what you probably see a lot more often in medieval warfare than in video games. The reason behind this is simplicity's sake. But what you'll notice is you have a group of archers, were protected by a halberdman as well as a man-at-arms, but being overseen by what might be a knight. Unlikely. Might be a hedge knight. Probably the greatest thing he's ever done. And you'll notice something else. They have a stake line. Now, stake line is as much to prevent cavalry from getting near them. Now, specifically, light cavalry would be fast enough to actually get close and actually hurt archers. Typically speaking, an archer might be able to outrun a tired knight's horse simply because of all the armor and plus the knight it has to carry. It's so slow. Sorry, I had to take a quick drink. Now, the reason why a mixed unit is important is because they give it multiple roles to do. Now, this is an artist rendition. Well, what you would actually probably have is a whole bunch of archers, a group of spearmen, and maybe a few men-at-arms behind them. Typically, the concept of what would happen is the archers would continue to fire until enemy infantry or horsemen got close enough to the stake line. Once they were, the pikemen, or halberdmen in this case, would then move immediately to the front and use the stake wall as a form of keeping the enemy at bay, as the distance between the base of the spike and the front of the spike is roughly about 4 to 3 feet depending on the actual stick itself. Meaning that if a swordsman, the bane of all spearmen, attempts to get close, he first has to wiggle around a stake. As you can see, the halberdman has positioned himself so that the end of his halberd is roughly at the slightly past where the stake is, which means he can start hitting away at the enemy before they even get to the stake. As well as the man-at-arms here. The man-at-arms here would probably be next to or directly behind a pikeman or halberdman, meaning that basically, should the halberdman/pikeman be unable to convince or coerce the swordsman to back away, he can immediately rush in, giving him time to back away and then use his weapon again. By this point, or even before, the archers will have regrouped behind the pikemen and men-at-arms in order to continue to rain fire on the enemy army. All these little things make for a very complicated mess. Now, one thing that's important, because you haven't truly seen it, this is what's called a spear block. Now, you've seen pike block. The difference between this is a spear is between 5 to 7 feet in length, meaning that it's roughly the average height of a man or maybe slightly longer. Now, the difference between pikemen and spearmen is spearmen are typically equipped with wooden shields. Now, this is once more from a game, so it looks like, they've got wooden shields that have a metal plate on the front and they're all nice and shiny. But in actuality, it'd be mostly out of wood with maybe a leather cover, designed to give it some weather protection. So that way it doesn't immediately start to fall apart when it rains. Now you'll notice the general position that they're in, as well as the general style of the shield. The men in front are kneeling, as well as having their spears protruded upwards. The men directly behind them have their shields above their heads, with the bottom portion of the shield covering the guys in front of them, while having their spears raised at another 45-degree angle, and then a couple ranks of reserves. Now, typically, this is more, hey, we can't fit enough models into a certain area, but basically you'd have a whole bunch of men squeezed together, and you wouldn't have this space between shields. You'd have completely shield to shield. Now, the purpose behind a spear block like this is to basically negate the effect of the enemy archers, while also making it very difficult for cavalry to have an effect. Now, once more, cavalry shock is something that will not be focused here, because that's very difficult and there's a lot of explanation to it. But simply put, a cavalry shock might just wipe out the entire front line here. All these men might die. But they're going to be taking a lot of horses with them, because of the combined effect of 2 ranks of spears that the enemy has to charge through. Because before the horse even gets to them, the horse goes through a spear, meaning in effect, that the horse dies, but so does the spearman. Now, here's something I'd like to point out real quick. A spearman, in terms of warfare, is a lot cheaper than a horse. A single spearman for a horseman is a price that's more than willing to be paid in terms of numbers. Additionally, should the knight fall forward from his horse, he would land upon the second row of spears, or maybe the third. If not, well, a spear is typically short enough to use at such a close range. A spear formation like this also is quite useful when in close quarters, as it means, similar to the pike formation, your enemy has to get through a wall of spears before it can get to you first. But with the addition of the shield, most damage, such as from a sword or whatnot, can be deflected or blocked. Same thing with an arrow. Now, the reason why there was historically a transition from spear blocks to pike blocks was the invention of a couple of things. Heavily armored cavalry, the persistent use of that cavalry, and then the evolution of the gun. Now let's move on to a little bit on the techniques on fighting, as we've currently I'll say that formation's pretty wrapped up. So first off, tactics. Now this simple little image shows what happens when two different types of formations meet. Now, here you have a phalanx. The Greek idea of, we're going to take pike and we're going to mix it with the spear. Basically, what you have is a pike block with shields. All the bonuses and all the negatives too. Now, this means that, once more, you have about 4 to 5 rows of guys to get through before you can even get to the guy in the front line. And you'll see all these Romans, they're using shields and swords. I mean, what's the insanity? Are these guys nuts? Well, there's a particular reason why. And you'll kind of notice this, or hopefully. You'll see that to a degree, that all the spears are in a certain line, i.e., the guy here and the 4 guys behind him, all their spears are to his right. Which means, if you're a Roman and you want to get to this guy, all you really have to do is keep your shield on the left or his right and just push it out of the way. And as long as you keep your shield angled to that degree and make sure to move, you can get to him, and because his spear is so long, he can't use that spear, and because the phalanx formation is so dense, he can't move, which means he can't run away. But the Romans also were a little ingenious. You see that the man here is throwing what looks like a javelin. Specifically, it's called a pila. I don't know what it means in Roman, but it's basically a javelin. Now, the difference between these are heavily weighted, so once it hits, it's designed to wear down the arm. Here's an excellent image. A pila has been embedded into the shield of this Greek. I forget what the term for their individual soldier was. But he's a member of the phalanx. Now, the typical way, as you can see in the background here, is before the Romans even get close, they just throw javelin after javelin after javelin. Which means they start getting embedded into the shields, or as in this closer image, on the spears. Now, these damn things, the shields and the spears, they're heavy enough. But now you're adding an extra 10, 15 pounds to each one, depending on the type of pila and how it hit and embedded, and how much of it actually made it. And then at the same time you're trying to stand, the Romans are just sitting there, letting you tire yourself out. And then they charge. And when they charge, they're bashing your spears all over the place. Your arms just get tired. And the Roman hasn't even got close to you yet. He's not tired. He threw javelins at you 10 minutes ago. That was the most exertion he did. And now he's close enough. His shield is super light. It's designed to be make. It's specifically designed for your to counter your formation. This is what the Romans found out. Formations have their bonuses, but they also have their negatives. The Romans exploited this, and the Greek states fell swiftly. They fought fiercely, but they fell swiftly. These were the descendants that held off a Persian empire. And this is another thing. The Romans were geniuses. Here, every man here is a standard Roman warrior. Each one of these men has been trained in the use of the gladius, and that these weapons are all their pila. But one thing in the Roman Empire is that they hardened the tips of the pila so that they may be used as spears. This is the origin of the proper spear block. As you saw in the medieval versions, these were terrifying. The front rows would use it as shields. The back rows would use them as javelins. The enemy becomes tired and reduced in number, and then meets spears. Once the spears become broken, or simply the enemy gets too close to use them, the Roman soldier begins to use his gladius, which is a short sword. The benefits of a short sword means that you need a very small amount of area to actually use it, like say the area directly behind a shield. Now, in the end, most things revolved around siege warfare. Specifically, the medieval era. In the medieval era, basically what would happen is a high-ranking lord or the king himself would decide, there's this fort or town that we want. From there, they would besiege it, and nearly 1,000 small battles would take place around the city. Some were relief forces, some counter-offensives, or small little missions to just capture a nearby village or pillage it. Now, siege warfare is a very complicated and messy affair. It's the messiest affairs of all. Simply put, both armies lose men and do nothing for weeks and months, depending on the condition of the fort and the attacking army. This image perfectly exemplifies a few of the siege warfare tools. I'll start with the right, a siege tower. The top of the tower is armed with archers. The archers here are actually taller than the top of the siege tower is actually taller than the wall, which allows the archers in the siege tower to actually shoot down on the defenders, which means that they don't get the protection of the wall. As it slowly gets moved, because siege towers weigh a shit ton, it gains protection from advancing archers, designed to keep these guys' heads down. So that way, while their heads are down, these archers up here can focus on actually killing them without being shot at back. As it eventually gets closer, a drawbridge towards the front will lower on top of the walls, and then from it will pour infantry. Another method, not known for actually breaking down walls, but more for actually collapsing the towers, which is far more important for these things, are catapults, or as the Romans called them, onagers. The principle for these is the exact same, with the design being slightly different. A high-tension cable is lowered down around, basically a spoon. A rock is then deployed into the spoon, the high-tension wire is let loose, and the resulting counterforce propels a projectile of some sort, usually a stone rock of a circular shape, towards the enemy position. Now you have to remember, these are very crude machines, that when they fire, literally the rears of these things lift. Which means, even if you get a good hit right about here, it's very hard to realign it so that you're going to hit higher. Additionally, over time, or if it rains, the rope might loosen or tighten up, which means it could rip easier, or simply mean that it doesn't have enough power as it once did. Another thing is the rolling wall, otherwise known as the push shield, or the archer shield. The purpose behind this is to slowly push archers forward, allowing them to more easily every day assault the enemy archers. As you might imagine, the less time your arrow has to fly, the less time the enemy has time to dodge it. That is the principle behind this. In the background is some battering rams. I believe I have a better picture, yes. The good old battering ram. Bunch of a giant cart with a roof and a bunch of wheels. Now, this takes us a little bit deeper into siege warfare. Towards the city walls, you can see what looks like a trebuchet. This is basically a glorified slingshot. Now, it uses more of a parabola motion rather than a direct slingshot, but it delivers its payload, if you will. Following that is a defensive trench line that once more you'll see has the stakes. Not only that, it's double trench lined, which means you have to go through two lines of defensive trenches, which are filled, as you can see here, with archers, swordsmen, and very likely spearmen. And there's two lines of it, and that's just to get to the walls. The walls here, you can see, have been taking a severe beating. Well, you gotta break down the walls, and then you gotta go through this. So as the besiegers are attempting to advance their little cart to break down that big old gate, they're constantly being harassed by the enemy, which means they have to build siege works. Now, these siege works are everything from simple wooden boards to make sure that the ground is hard enough for the battering ram to go through without sinking into the mud, to, once more, stakes to prevent cavalry and slow down infantry. Now, even with this, as you can see here, a small little fire is all it takes. Believe this might be the it. Nope. Now, what happens once you get inside the city? You get past the walls, you break them down. Well, one of two things happen. Desperate fighting like this, where both sides attempt to use formations, or, as something we've seen far more in modern times, small-scale fighting. One or two men fighting another three, maybe four men, slowly advancing through a city, trying desperately just to kill and survive. Now, that basically summarizes. It's a really simplistic look on warfare. Extremely simplistic. I've been recording this for nearly an hour, and there's a lot more I'd like to say. There's, of course, the economics, the effects of warfare on both countries, how to wear down your enemy, what are the few best tactics to use against an enemy. But, well, I've tried to give a simple overview. Hope you guys enjoyed it.